Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome back to another episode of How to Speak Victorian. I've had a little break from How to Speak Victorian, I think partly because I spent a very long time talking about Dickens and that seemed to take up quite a lot of video space, but here we are back with How to Speak Victorian. So far in this series I have given you an introduction to my love to Victorian literature, and then I went through a brief historical overview of the period. I say brief, it was a very, very long video, and then I gave an also not very brief literary history of the period. But today, and for the next few episodes of How to Speak Victorian, I'm going to be going through some of the key literary figures of the Victorian world. So today and the next episode I'm going to be talking about novelists of the Victorian period, and then going to do an episode on poets, and then going to do an episode on sort of dramatists and the Victorian theatre, and then I'm going to do another episode on sort of essayists and non-fiction writers of the Victorian periods. And by the time that is over in several months, I will start doing videos about some of the important themes in the Victorian period and in Victorian literature. That is my plan for How to Speak Victorian. So, today, Victorian novelists. So because the Victorian period is host to quite a lot of prolific novelists, rather than spending just one video talking about Victorian novelists, I'm going to spread it over two. So this week we will have part one of the Victorian novelists, and next Monday we will have part two of the Victorian novelists. I was going to try and do it chronologically, and then I realised that everyone crosses over too much, so I'm just going to go alphabetically by surname. I figured that was a more sensible way to order my authors. So, let's begin. As always, I'm not an expert, just a massive enthusiast for the Victorian period, so do please look up stuff about these authors elsewhere and do definitely have a read of all of their books. I say that, I haven't read a book by everyone I'm going to mention. There are a few other important Victorian novelists that I'm going to mention that I haven't read yet, but I hope to at some point in the future. They are kind of on my TBR along with every other single book in the world. I'm also going to link down below a website called Victorian Web, which I've spoken about before, which has a massive amount of material about the Victorian period and about Victorian literature, and there's one page there which lists sort of all the authors that are mentioned on the site and everything that is kind of spoken about them, and it has a lot of material about a lot of Victorian authors. So yes, let's get into the authors. So let's start off with R.D. Blackmore. R.D. Blackmore was born in Berkshire, which is now Oxfordshire, in 1825, and he died in Middlesex in 1900. I have only read one R.D. Blackmore book, and that is this one, Lorna Doone, which I really like. R.D. Blackmore wrote quite a lot of novels. He was quite a prolific novelist and wrote kind of a range of novels, often of a kind of romantic tradition, often historical novels. Lorna Doone is set in the 17th century and is kind of about rural kind of feuding families. It is a really brilliant book, one I really love. Lorna Doone is one of his only books that has kind of survived into the modern world. A lot of the rest of them have gone out of print. Although Lorna Doone remains quite popular and quite famous, the rest of his writing has been a little bit forgotten, which is a shame. I'd really like to read something else by him actually, and I'd love to reread Lorna Doone because I haven't read this since I was a teenager and I really, really enjoyed it. He's quite an interesting Victorian novelist, and I find Victorian historical fiction and the way that the Victorians were reflecting on stuff that had happened a few centuries ago really interesting, because it tells you an awful lot about the Victorian period, even though they're writing about before. It's really cool. Anyway, as I said, I'm going to try and zoom through a lot of authors, so apologies if I don't make too much mention, especially of the ones that I have not read that much of. Mary Braddon was born in 1835 in London, and she died in Richmond in 1915. And Mary Braddon was a very, very prolific writer. She published something like over 80 novels in her life. She wrote a lot of books, a lot of kind of sensation fiction and very, very popular fiction during the Victorian period. Her most famous novel, the one that kind of has survived till today and is still being read, is Lady Audley's Secret. I have not read this, but I would really like to. It's definitely on my TBR, along with, as I said, many other books. So at some point in the future I will hopefully be getting to her. Next, let's talk about the Bronte sisters. We have Anne Bronte, we have Charlotte Bronte, and we have Emily Bronte. The Bronte sisters were a trio of sisters, all who were born and died in Yorkshire. They were the three daughters of a clergyman. They also had a brother, Branwell, who was quite wild, drank a lot of alcohol, possibly took a lot of drugs, and died quite young. In fact, they all died quite young. They had all four of the siblings had quite a tragic life, and they also had some other siblings that died in childhood. But I'm quickly going to talk about the three Bronte sisters here. I love all of the Bronte sisters very, very much. They all write absolutely brilliant fiction. I really, really love them. So let's start off alphabetically with Anne Bronte. Anne Bronte was born, as I said, in Yorkshire in 1820, and she died in 1849 from tuberculosis very young. Like her sisters, she was a governess as well as a novelist and a poet. She wrote and published two novels during her lifetime. One is Agnes Grey and one is The Tenant of Wharfell Hall. Both of these I really love. I think The Tenant of Wharfell Hall is a much more ambitious novel than Agnes Grey. Agnes Grey is about a governess and then she meets a man, and it's kind of nice, and bits of it feel a bit kind of Austen-y, but with a kind of work ethic in it in a way, or a kind of exploration of being of a slightly lower class than most of the characters in Austen, in that the central character Agnes Grey is a governess, and it does deal with the kind of difficulties that governesses could face in Victorian society, but it's kind of a much more straightforward narrative. And The Tent of Wilford Hall is a much more complicated novel, really fascinating in terms of exploring Victorian gender roles and the kind of dynamics between men and women and the kind of institution of marriage. Basically, the central character in The Tent of Wilford Hall gets sort of trapped into a marriage with a man who is very drunk and very abusive, and the novel explores that in a really interesting and complicated way. It's also kind of influenced by lots of Gothic stuff, and it's a shame that Anne Bronte gets a bit forgotten in comparison to her other sisters, because I think her novels are really brilliant. Charlotte Bronte. So Charlotte Bronte was born, again, in Yorkshire in 1816. She died in 1855, still quite young, even though she did survive both of her sisters. She died in childbirth. She'd only been married about a year. Charlotte Bronte has 4 novels which were written during her lifetime. The Professor, I believe, was only published after her death, even though it was the first one she wrote. And then the novels published during her lifetime were Jane Eyre, of course, very, very famous, Villette, which is very, very brilliant and should be as famous as Jane Eyre because it's wonderful, and also Shirley. I haven't read Shirley, but I'm hoping to within the next month. Jane Eyre and Villette and the Professor, a bit like Agnes Grey, explore kind of what it's like to be a teacher or a governess. And I think Charlotte and Anne, both of their work deal in a really interesting way with what it is like to be a woman who is neither working class or sort of middle or upper class. To be a governess or a teacher is quite a kind of, not dubious, but it's a complicated position within Victorian society, and I love the way the Brontes explore that kind of social tension, as well as dealing with kind of Gothic influences and overtones of the supernatural and ghosts and that sort of thing. I think, yeah, they're dark books, but they're also kind of realistic books in the same way, in a great way. So Emily Bronte. Emily Bronte was born in 1818, again in Yorkshire, and she died in 1848. She again died very sadly, very young, from tuberculosis, like her sister Anne. Although, like her sisters, she did write some poetry. She only wrote one novel during her lifetime, and that was The Wonderful Wuthering Heights, which is one of my favourite books of all time, easily in my top 5 books of all time. It's just brilliant. I love it so much. It's weird, and I understand why a lot of people don't like it, and it's got a weird narrative structure, which is like a story within a story within a story, but I just love it. I think it's brilliant and so powerful, and I love that I hate everyone in it, but I also sympathise with them completely and understand them, and that is, I think, one of the most powerful things you can do in literature. Basically, it's great. The Brontes are great. Also, an important thing to note about the 3 Bronte sisters, all of them did not publish under their own names. They all published under pseudonyms. They published under the names Acton, Courier and Ellis Bell. So it's quite interesting to note that they all published under pseudonyms that were kind of gender neutral, and a lot of people did assume that their books were written by men, especially stuff like Wuthering Heights that deals with a lot of violence, and there's a lot of violent imagery, and people at the time were like, oh, a woman couldn't possibly have written that. And also that they all chose to keep the same surname. They wanted the association between their works, which I think is kind of nice and interesting. And a lot of people actually speculated that the books were by the same person, which is another interesting fact about the Brontes. Anyway, next author. Next, Edward Bulwer-Lytton. Now this is another author I don't know that much about and I haven't read anything by. Edward Bulwer-Lytton was born in Norfolk in 1803 and he died in Torquay in 1873. He was a politician and also a very popular novelist during the Victorian period. A lot of people enjoyed his books. They sold very, very well, but he's one of those Victorian authors that has been a little bit forgotten, and his works haven't quite made it into the canon, and I think at times critics have been a little bit dismissive of his style. I haven't actually read anything by him. I really would like to, because I'm genuinely quite curious. I know he wrote a lot of kind of satire and witty novels and some kind of crime novels. Although some of the books that we remember and still hold up from the Victorian period, like, you know, authors like Dickens and George Eliot and Hardy, they did sell really well. But there were also a lot of authors who were selling so many novels in the Victorian period and have kind of been forgotten about, and I think even if they're not like the greatest literary works ever, which they might be, I don't know, I haven't read them, it's still really interesting to read them to get a sense of what people in the Victorian period like to read. I would certainly like to read something by Edward Bulwer-Lytton. He was actually the author that came up with that opening sentence, "It was a dark and stormy night," which is the first sentence of his novel Paul Clifford. Next, briefly, we're going to talk about Samuel Butler, another author who I'm afraid I know very little about. He was born in Nottinghamshire in 1835 and he died in London in 1902. His most famous work is called Erewhon. I think I'm saying it wrong. It's nowhere backwards and it's a kind of satire utopian thing. It is apparently a bit like Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. I wasn't a massive fan of Gulliver's Travels. I don't know if I would like Samuel Butler's Erewhon because it is a kind of Victorian version or a Victorian take on Gulliver's Travels, or if I would not like it because it's apparently quite similar to Gulliver's Travels in terms of its style and tone. I don't know. Anyway, I'm sure I'll find out at some point because I would like to read it. He's been considered quite an important and significant author in terms of the development of kind of dystopian, utopian science fiction stuff. Anyway, next author. Always very important, of course, to mention Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll was born in Cheshire in 1832 and he died in Surrey in 1898. I've only read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I haven't read Through the Looking Glass because I read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland on Kindle before I got this copy, so I'm gonna read Alice Through the Looking Glass at some point this year. I really loved Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It was so weird in a kind of just wonderful way, in a kind of what the hell is going on, do I care, no I don't care kind of way. It's brilliant and it's odd and it's really interesting. If you look at Alice in Wonderland in terms of Victorian literature, it is so different from the kind of realism of Trollope and Hardy and Gissing and all of those people. But in authors like Dickens, who is obsessed with kind of coincidences and overtones of the supernatural, who has these kind of exaggerated, overtly eccentric characters, you can kind of see a meeting between Victorian realism and the nonsense writing of Alice in Wonderland, I think. I think that's a really interesting thing in Victorian literature, is that you have all these kind of interests coming in from various angles. Next, let's talk about Wilkie Collins. Wilkie Collins was born in London in 1824 and died still in London in 1898. He was a good friend of Charles Dickens, which is something I obviously find quite interesting as a Dickens obsessive, and Wilkie Collins has quite an interesting literary career. He's often been considered one of the sort of fathers of the detective novel and of kind of mystery writing fiction. Certainly The Moonstone and The Woman in White, which are the only two novels of his I've read, both deal quite heavily with a kind of detective driven plot structure. They also make use of multiple narrators in a way that I find really interesting. I love both of these. I read them both when I was a teenager and I haven't read anything by him since, which is a shame because I really enjoyed both of them, so I'm really hoping to pick up some more Wilkie Collins in the future. He has a really engaging narrative style and I like the way his books deal with issues of truth and who you can trust and that kind of thing. And also The Woman in White deals quite interestingly with like Victorian perceptions of mental illness and that sort of thing, which I think is quite interesting. There's also some really great class stuff in his writing, especially in The Moonstone. Actually, there's one of the characters in The Moonstone, one of the narrators is a servant, and the way he views sort of the upper classes is really interesting. And he has this moment where he talks about like the hobbies of young women and men from the upper classes because they're really bored because they don't have work, and he kind of reflects on what that means for how they behave and their kind of concerns in life in comparison to him because he's always occupied with work. And it's just like a really interesting reflection on the Victorian class system. And yeah, lots of interesting stuff as well as all the like mystery gripping stuff. Yeah, it's great. Anyway, need to read more Wilkie Collins. Next, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, I am wearing a different top. I was editing my video and I suddenly realised that I'd skipped someone on my list and I thought, this is terrible, I have to mention Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was born in Edinburgh in 1859 and he died in Sussex in 1930. He is most famous, of course, for being the creator of Sherlock Holmes and writing many detective stories. He was kind of the beginnings, in a way, of detective fiction. Him and Wilkie Collins and some aspects, some of the crime plot lines in Dickens really form like the beginning of a tradition of detective fiction in English literature, which obviously makes Sir Arthur Conan Doyle very interesting. But he didn't just write detective fiction, he also wrote kind of adventure stories and some kind of travel stories. The only things I have read of his are a few Sherlock Holmes short stories and also The Lost World, which is not a Victorian novel, it's something he wrote after the Victorian period, but obviously his creation of Sherlock Holmes and his detective fiction during the Victorian period is very influential and very important. Back to past Katie. Next, let's quickly talk about Joseph Conrad. When I first wrote my list of Victorian novelists, I forgot to include him because I never think of him as Victorian because he's so near the end of the Victorian period, and also he was born in Poland, but he did live in Britain for a substantial amount of his life and he did write in English, so I feel like he still counts as a Victorian writer. Joseph Conrad was born in 1857. He was born in a place that had previously been part of Poland, is now part of Ukraine, and was at the time when he was born part of the Russian Empire. However, he moved in his life to Britain and spent a lot of his life in Britain and was a British citizen by the time of his death and for quite a lot of his life. He died in Kent in 1924, and one of his most famous books, the only one I have read, is this one, which is Heart of Darkness, which was published in 1898, I believe. Heart of Darkness is a really interesting book. It's set mostly in the Congo and it's about kind of the British Empire and the effects of imperialism on the rest of the world, and its effect both on like sort of what's physically going on but also on like people's sanity and the way people perceive things. It's a really interesting book that I feel like I don't quite understand it and I need to kind of return to Conrad and read something else by him. But anyway, and the next author is of course my favourite to my love, Charles Dickens. I was going to try and hold up even more Dickens books than this, but I have so many it was just a losing battle, so there we go. Yes, Dickens books, I have many. Right. Charles Dickens was born in Portsmouth in 1812 and he died in Rochester in Kent in 1870. He published 14 completed novels during his lifetime, along with a lot of short works and short stories, including his very famous Christmas books, which have gone on to be very widely celebrated. Charles Dickens is probably, I would say, the most famous Victorian novelist. He was one of the most famous novelists during his own time, time as well, and he was very, very popular. He was so much beloved. He had like a massive kind of celebrity about him in a really interesting way that was kind of rising in a new manner in the Victorian period. You know, he travelled the country and the world. He went to America and all Paris and all sorts of other places reading extracts from his novels, and people loved him so much. If you want to know more about Dickens, there's plenty of stuff on my channel, plenty of places you can learn about Dickens. Please go check out my What the Dickens series, in which I spoke about each of Dickens's novels for about 10 minutes each over 2 weeks. There was a lot of Dickens. There's a lot to say about Charles Dickens's significance as a literary figure in the Victorian period. I think one of the most important things to say is that he was a great social critic, and most of his books, I would say all of his books, have not exactly a social agenda, but he is criticising certain things about Victorian society. And a thing Dickens has been criticised for a lot is pointing out what was wrong with the Victorian society without ever offering any kind of real solution apart from let's all love each other. But I kind of understand that, because that's how I feel about the world a lot of the time. Like, that's what my politics is. I think everything is wrong, let's all just be happy and nice, which isn't how you solve problems. But I kind of love that about Dickens, that there is a lot of anger and despair at society in Dickens, but there's also a deep love for and hope in humanity, which makes me very happy, because Dickens is great. He wrote a lot of very interesting novels in their structure. There are a lot of very long novels with a lot of different characters and a lot of interweaving plots, which is something that becomes very popular in the Victorian period, and Dickens was really a bit of a champion of. It's also very interesting in terms of the beginnings of detective fiction. Inspector Bucket in Bleak House is said to be one of the earliest detectives in English literature, and I think books like Bleak House and Charles Dickens's interest in crime certainly influenced his friend Wilkie Collins and sort of later writers like Gissing. I think he's also a very interesting writer in terms of overall Victorian scene, in the way that he kind of brings together that interest in kind of Gothic and the supernatural with this kind of realism and this desire to criticise what's going on in society and to talk about like real social issues. I think that's a really interesting mix and something that is quite important in Victorian literature. Anyway, that's the briefest thing I've ever said about Charles Dickens. Let's move on quickly before I go on a tangent. Next, we're going to talk about Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli was born and died in London. He was born in 1804 and lived until 1881. He was a politician and the Prime Minister and a novelist. Again, the Victorian period was cool. He was Prime Minister twice, and he was also a novelist. He was publishing novels while he was an MP, and in fact, in between his two sprints as Prime Minister, he also published another novel, so he was still like a novelist while he was a politician. Isn't that just great? I'm sorry, I just think that's really fun. He's a very intriguing character, Disraeli, actually. Completely aside from his novels, I think he's a really fascinating political figure and a fascinating historical figure, one of the most interesting in the Victorian period. When he was young, he was a radical, and he modelled his lifestyle and his clothing choice on Lord Byron, and he wore like really eccentric clothes. Benjamin Disraeli went on to be a Conservative MP and minister. He was also quite an interesting figure in that he was ethnically Jewish, although he had converted to Christianity at a young age, and for someone who was ethnically Jewish to end up being Prime Minister in Victorian society, that was quite a big deal really, because of his interest in politics and his position and the position that he held within society. Disraeli's novels are often quite political, and they often are kind of carrying a certain particular agenda. I've only read one of his books, Sybil or the Two Nations, which is probably his most famous book, although Consingbee and Lothair, I don't entirely know how to say either of them. They are both also quite well known, and two that I would really like to read. I actually really enjoyed Sybil. I read it quite recently. So, you know, Benjamin Disraeli's books, they deal quite heavily with how difficult life is for a lot of the working classes in the 19th century, and he deals quite interestingly with kind of industrialisation and what's going on especially in the north of England. But at the same time, there's also this kind of paternalistic feeling of, oh, they don't know what's best for them, but their lives are hard. And it's kind of they're problematic, but they're really interesting historically. And I also found Sybil just quite a good novel to read. I liked it. I thought the characters were good and the plot was good, and I loved it. Yeah, anyway, Benjamin Disraeli. Better novelist than I thought he might be. Next, another very significant author during the Victorian period, and that is George Eliot. Now, George Eliot, I have such mixed feelings about George Eliot. I've read two of her books, these ones, Silas Marner and Middlemarch. There are many more I would like to read. I would love, love, love to read Daniel Deronda. I really want to read it, and I really want to read Mill on the Floss as well, which I'm possibly going to read in the next month. We will see what happens. I have so many other books I want to read. George Eliot is a pen name. Her actual name was Mary Ann Evans. She was born in Warwickshire in 1819. She died in Middlesex in 1880. George Eliot wrote a lot of social criticism novels, and she was more embedded in realism, I would say, than Dickens. Even though both of them are critiquing certain things about society, George Eliot's novels have a much more realistic bent. You know, when you read Charles Dickens, it's like you're being told a story. There is this kind of storytelling voice that's carrying you through. George Eliot is more like she's trying to set out a portrait of society. The subtitle of Middlemarch is even a study of provincial life, and there is something about George Eliot's writing that feels a bit like a study, which is maybe the reason why I haven't got on with her that well, because I feel like I lack emotional engagement when I read George Eliot. Middlemarch I liked from about here, but it's a very long book to take 600 pages to get into. I appreciate what she's trying to do. I think she's a fascinating writer and very, very important within the Victorian literary scene. The way she examines problems of the Victorian society, especially in kind of like a small town environment, the way she examines both like how politics operates, things about gender, things about marriage, things about people's idea of what they should be doing with their lives in Victorian society, stuff about morality and age and science and so much stuff. Like, she deals with a lot of fascinating themes, and like the characters are really rich, but her writing style is for me not that good. And for me, like, when Charles Dickens does the grand Victorian novel with many characters, he switches between the characters in a way that keeps you forever engaged, whereas for me, with George Eliot, she just gives you like 200-page block of one character who might be the character you don't like, and then it's kind of boring. But yeah, I need to read more by George Eliot before I completely judge her. I think she's, yeah, very important. I respect her work more than I like it at the moment, but that may change in the future. Anyway, I think that will do for now for the first of this two-part video, because I don't want it to get too long, because that's been a lot of authors and a lot of information to shoot at you. So this has been Victorian authors from A to E. That doesn't sound like very far. I promise it's just because there are a lot of Victorian novelists whose surname begin with like B, C and D. This is halfway through my list. I don't know how that happened. It's really, really random. I think it's the Brontes. The Brontes have like skewed things. I'll be back on Thursday with another video, and I'll be back next Monday with the second half of this video to talk about all the more Victorian novelists, all the other important people who are writing books during the Victorian period. Oh, there were so many. I'm excited. Don't forget to let me know what you thought down in the comments if you have read any of these authors. If you have read anything by the authors I haven't read anything by, I would really appreciate any recommendations or that sort of thing. And yes, I will see you very soon.